Hello, this is Heward Wilkinson, and this is a version of my talk about John Wisdom and his peculiar relationship to what he came to call philosophical perplexity, but which I increasingly have been thinking about as a form of philosophical cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance we can understand as a profound existential conflict of beliefs that has to be resolved, and often is resolved if people cannot tolerate the uncertainty by an intenser retreat into the extremer version of whatever the belief in question may be. And in a manner of speaking, John Wisdom tells us, lets us know that philosophical perplexities themselves are so inveterate because they expose us, if we take them seriously, to intolerable conflicts and contradictions, which we oscillate between one possible solution or another, and different people are drawn in different ways, and so on. And Wisdom brings this out with a grace, a depth, and an intensity that very few others do. He was perhaps the most original, maybe Elizabeth Anscombe is up there with him, but perhaps one of the most, very most original of those who were deeply influenced by Wittgenstein. And he takes things in a somewhat different direction, although he's certainly planted in Wittgensteinian soil, as we might say, and yet at the same time, the flavor and mode of his communications is very different. I was fortunate and privileged enough to have some experience of him in the time when I was at Cambridge in the 60s. And he was an exceptionally gracious, whimsical, and yet profound person, but one who always was deeply considerate of others and made you feel very important in whatever questions you might be pursuing as you explored what I understood so little then, but gradually have become to make sense of over the decades since that time. And just a tiny example of his way of doing things, just for fun. He could be discussing the most intensely serious thing. His major publication was Other Minds. This is the earlier version, 1952 or 53. And there's a later book, which is also a very important, called Proof and Explanation, which is the condensation of his Virginia lectures from 1957 or 58, I can't remember exactly which, but which costs an arm and a leg, even if you get it from Abe Books. So here's this tiny example of his exploration of other minds. Some people would say, this is from Other Minds 4, some people would say that it is senseless to talk of now really finding out what happened in the past, or whether there has been any past. But that doesn't mean that we can't understand the suggestion that though all the evidence now suggests and will suggest that Charles I was executed, someone in fact took his place and he escaped to live quietly in Savernake Forest for the rest of his days. He used to keep bees. And that kind of sweet humorousness deeply characterized his work. I believe it is the case that he, at some deep level, accepted radically a sense datum theory of experience, and that at the same time, he operates within a full acceptance at one level of common sense. So I'm going to just indicate what I think the background to this may be, and it's ultimately Kant's, and before Kant, Hume's philosophy, in which sense experience is ultimately all we have, and therefore, if we live in a cocoon or a brain in a vat of our own internal world, even in the most acutely external things, agony, torture, the collision of an aircraft, and so forth, even so, all of it has to be transmitted via our inner world and our inner experience. And whilst we may not go all the way with Kant in thinking that things in themselves are not in time and space, it's more likely that Wilfrid Sellers' view that they are in an analogous but different time and space may be more defensible. And so the whole of our experience, including time and space, as Kant rightly pointed out, is a systemic unity, and we have it in our immediacy in all sorts of ways. Maybe we can talk about this in discussing it, but I'm going to put that forward as a hypothesis on the table. And I think that the situation with John Wisdom was that, and also with Wittgenstein, was that at some level they accepted that, but sought to relate that to the rest of experience in a way which is ultimately Kantian and draws upon Kantian arguments, which are replicated by Wittgenstein, the arguments of the transcendental deduction of the categories, that experience has to be consistent in a certain way for us to have certain kinds of identity. And that is replicated in the philosophical investigations of Wittgenstein, number 142. And Wisdom assumes it. Indeed, his fundamental arguments are based upon it. Now, that understanding of things is very disconcerting for many people. And the material that I circulated about the symposium from 1946 of other minds, about other minds, in which J.L. Austin and A.J. equally took part. Just to park the A.J.'s contribution, he argues that internally that we may know that someone is concealing thoughts quite indisputably, and therefore we have an indirect way of knowing that they have a mind other than ours, which they experience in a way that is analogous to us. But of course, there is arguing within a Kantian frame, and of course, believed in a sense data and phenomenalistic understanding of experience pretty well for the whole of his philosophical career. So I come now to J.L. Austin, and J.L. Austin's contribution to the symposium is very interesting. First of all, I want to point out with a quotation from Sense and Sensibilia, that Austin ultimately retreats to a position of common sense, and a great deal of his vehemence in that book, Sense and Sensibilia, against Ayer's position is based on that belief in common sense. And here it comes out quite unequivocally on page 114 when he's talking about incorrigibility. incorrigibility of my knowledge of experience. Now, in certain ways, I believe he is right, and in some ways that doesn't affect the issue, but I'll come back to that later. So he says, whether I have complete confidence in a statement is not a matter of what kind of sentence I use in making my statement, but of what the circumstances are in which I make it. And here he plays with the sense datum theory. If I carefully scrutinize some patch of color in my visual field, take careful note of it, know English well, and pay scrupulous attention to just what I am saying, I may say, it seems to me now as if I were seeing something pink, and nothing whatever could be produced as showing that I had made a mistake. But equally, if I watch for some time an animal a few feet in front of me in a good light, if I prod it, perhaps sniff, take note of the noises it makes, I may say, that's a pig. And that too will be incorrigible. Austin kept pigs, by the way. Nothing could be produced that would show that I had made a mistake. Once one drops the idea that there is a special kind of sentence which is as such incorrigible, one might as well admit what is plainly true anyway, that many kinds of sentences may be uttered in making statements which are in fact incorrigible, in the sense that when they are made, their circumstances are such that they are quite certainly, definitely, and unretractably true. So, like G. Moore, who was also around during all of this, but unlike him in that ostensibly Austin does not believe in sense data, though I think it's possible to show that in fact he clearly does. He takes up a position of common sense certainty, and there's an element in Wittgenstein and wisdom which is not in that position, but nevertheless is not in a traditionally skeptical or phenomenalistic position instead. And I will now come on to what position Austin does take up, and it's very close to Wittgenstein's in uncertainty, in that it is a fideistic position. It is a position that we can't disprove, that certain statements and beliefs are so certain that nothing possibly could confute them, but that nothing therefore possibly would confirm them either. And therefore we have to accept them in a kind of faith. I'll bring that out by this particular quotation right at the end of Austin's response to wisdom in Other Minds. So he's examining philosophical skepticism about other minds. The question pushed further becomes a challenge to the very possibility of believing another man in its ordinarily accepted sense at all. What justification is there for supposing that there is another mind communicating with you at all? Justification placed in inverted commas, as it is below when we will get to the second use of it. How can you know what it would be like for another mind to feel anything? And so how can you understand it? It is then that we're tempted to say that we only mean by believing him that we take certain vocal noises as signs of certain impending behavior, and that other minds are no more real than unconscious desires. This, however, is distortion. It seems rather that believing in other persons, in authority and testimony, is an essential part of the act of communicating, an act which we all constantly perform. It is much an irreducible part of our experience as, say, giving promises or playing competitive games or even sensing colored patches. We can state certain advantages of such performances. We can elaborate rules of a kind for their rational conduct, as the law courts and historians and psychologists work out the rules for accepting testimony. AJ's contribution kind of is in that space. but there is no justification, inverted commas, on and off, no justification for our doing them as such. And that is the kind of a priori fideism that he arrives at in paradoxical unanimity with Wittgenstein and the Wittgenstein of the later philosophical investigations and of uncertainty. And the pathway to that is paradoxically very similar to that which wisdom has pursued in other minds. But I think the tone and the note is different. The tone and the note are that Austin is trying to produce reassurance and therefore safety for common sense in a very broad sense of the term, whereas neither wisdom nor Wittgenstein are attempting to do that, although in a certain sense they both take it for granted. Philosophically, they're not in that position. So what is wisdom doing? And here we come to the way in which he supplements something in Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein and wisdom are both more inclined to accept the incorrigibility thesis about self-awareness of our personal experience. And I think Austin is right about this. And it's interesting that Wittgenstein, when he is challenged with an example that takes us in a different direction, he asks the question, I can't remember which part of investigations it is, that he asks the question, how it can describe the taste of coffee. Why can't we do it? And what is it that we can't do? And the answer to that is people do it, and they use analogies to evoke it. But it's certainly a matter of an acquired taste and certainly an expertise, a connoisseur kind of experience. And that shows that our capacity to describe our own inner world is very, very variable indeed. And we can be mistaken about it. I thought I was anxious, but I was in fact excited, and so on and so forth. We can go into detail about that later. But nevertheless, the structural argument in the Kantian sense remains the same. And this comes out in wisdom in particular, an example of his method, which to some extent he got from Wittgenstein, but he takes it much further. And he considers the case, which is argued in concise form in his contribution to the Symposium of Other Minds. He considers the case of, if you imagine a feather in each of my hands, how do we weigh feathers? And if we do it just by feel, we may not be able to sense the difference between two feathers. Though, of course, we took a very large corvid type feather in one hand and a tiny little feather that had fallen from the breast feathers of a jay in the other, we might be able to just tell the difference. But wisdom envisages a super expert at the field of weight called Mr. Scales, and imagines in what circumstances we will believe Mr. Scales. And the short answer is that if the systematic judgments of Mr. Scales roughly correspond to those of weighing machines and of electronic testers of weight and of our own experience of relatively light things and so on and so forth, if it's all coherent and consistent, then we accept it, and that's the Kantian position. But of course, if Mr. Scales is discrepant from the best machine we have, we may wonder, is there something wrong with the machine, or is Mr. Scales having an off day? And the answer, of course, is established by further consistencies one way or the other. If the machine is persistently different from Mr. Scales, but Mr. Scales is ad hoc ordinary judgments correspond with others that he has made in the past, then we may well say there's something wrong with the machine. And so it goes on. Now, what wisdom argues is that the same logic applies to our awareness of other people's private feelings. When we're thinking about the problem of other minds, we, in our ordinary common sense, way are inclined to think, I know more about my own feelings and experience than you ever can, and absolutely you can't ultimately know what I feel. Just as the causal theories of belief in the external world will say we can't ultimately prove there is anything beyond sense data, as Kant implicitly acknowledges, but we know there is because we accept the understanding of causality, unless, of course, we have Hume's problem about it. But I won't go into all of that, but there are parallels here constantly being brought out by wisdom's dialectical way of doing things. Now, he very conveniently conducts it in the form of dialogue, and he has 5 participants which are named after colours. They're all real names, so it's quite convenient, but nevertheless you think of the colours when you're reading black, white, brown, green, grey, and there it is. That's how he conducts it. And in the case of other minds, he the parallel to the situation with Mr. Scales is the situation where we have unusual powers of telepathic experience. And there we get a sequence of things which eventually comes out in the form of a revelation. Brown says, and this is in Other Minds 5, that basically we don't know that we have a tin tack in our foot. We just know we have a certain experience of pain. He goes on at great length about this. It's necessary to realize that this last is true only if one does not mean by pain in the foot more than a certain kind of sensation, which as luck will have it has constantly been found connected with a thorn or tin tack in the foot. Now, what I wish to suggest is that though in fact we never do have that sort of knowledge of the mind of another, which each of us has of the immediate contents of his own mind, we could have it. And white and black have now reached the point of no return in this argument, and the following dialogue ensues. White, what I now want to assert is that this is impossible, that it is an absurd idea, and therefore real knowledge of the mind of another is impossible. Black, that's what I've been saying all along. White, yes, and I want to say that what you've been saying is true, only necessarily true. Grey, but I thought you'd been disagreeing with black. White, but now I've come to see that what he says is true. I have indeed come to see how very true it is. Grey, to say that it is necessarily true that we don't know what is going on in the minds of others is to say that it is impossible that we should know what is going on in their minds. Black didn't say that this was impossible, but that it never happens. And up to now, you haven't said that it is impossible, but such talk lacked any sense. White, yes, but that was quite inadequate. The phrase, know what is going on in the mind of another, isn't just a phrase without a use like Pyrrho's carolise ellatically. It isn't merely that when someone talks of knowing, really knowing what is going on in the mind of another, we have no idea what he means. On the contrary, we have an idea of what he means. But on examination, we find that it is out of the question not merely something that is in fact out of the question, like providing everyone with gold teeth or a pair of elephants, but something that is unimaginable because it hides a contradiction. And Black says, as for me, I did in fact say not merely that we never do, but that we can't know what is going on in the mind of others. True, I didn't then realize what sort of can't this was, whether like the can't in I can't make out what the people on the next floor do in the evenings, or like the can't in I can't get a triangular flag with four corners. But I realize now that it is the latter it is like. When first one says we can never really know what lies in the future, it feels as if this were because the door to the future is one that we happen to have no key. On trying to think of what it would be really to know today what will happen tomorrow, it soon appears that it's more like the impossibility of seeing perfectly clear dreams. So fundamentally, wisdom places the two positions in the same boat, even though he recognizes there is a uniqueness about the asymmetry between my awareness of my own feelings and sensations and yours in relation to mine, that is unique in the whole system of the arguments that are arising. But nevertheless, the Kantian logic inexorably forces us to the parallel conclusion in the two situations. And it also forces us to a slight revision of what Wittgenstein is up to when he says, I can't be said to know I have feelings. I simply have them. I know that I have feelings is what we say, and what we mean is I actually have feelings. But what wisdom brings out is that nevertheless, the uniqueness of the knowledge that I have is, as it were, non-functional knowledge. It's not because there is no way in which it can be challenged, because we've eliminated all the possible challenges, including telepathy, then it's an inactive rather than a nonsensical position to take. And the uncertainty about the incorrigibility of feelings doesn't affect that. All it means is that it slightly complicates it. And if we go right down to the end, we have the final words after wisdom has quoted Virginia Woolf's remarks about the awareness of others, and she ends up in Jacob's room in the awareness of others. She says, letters are venerable, the telephone valiant, for the journey is a lonely one, and if bound together by notes and telephone, we went in company perhaps. Who knows, we might talk by the way. And wisdom goes on. This isolation, which we may defeat but cannot vanquish, does it find voice in the old puzzle as to whether or not we really know what is in the mind of others? Does the contradiction in the philosopher's request for perfect knowledge of others reflect a conflict in the human heart which dreads and yet demands the otherness of others? And there, with a bow to John Wisdom, I will end.